Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are. Today we're going to talk about something that might surprise you, what getting high actually looked like in the Middle Ages. Because yes, medieval people absolutely got high. They just did it in ways that were simultaneously more creative, more dangerous, and considerably more weird than anything you've encountered. But before we dive in, if you enjoy what I do here, please subscribe. It genuinely means the world to me. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I am always thrilled to see people watching from every corner of the world. Now, let's go get medieval. You're sitting in a field. It is a warm afternoon in rural England, approximately 12:30, and you have been working since before dawn. Your back aches in the specific, comprehensive way that a back aches when it has been bending over crops for 6 hours. Your hands are rough. Your feet are tired. The sun is finally beginning to lower toward the horizon, and the specific grinding exhaustion of the medieval agricultural day is settling into your bones with the comfortable weight of something that will be repeated tomorrow and the day after and every day after that until the harvest is in or you die, whichever comes first. And then your neighbour, who has been working the adjacent strip all day, sits down beside you and produces something from a cloth pouch at his belt. It might be a small clay pipe. It might be a leather flask of something that smells strongly herbal and slightly alarming. It might be a handful of dried plant material that he pinches between his fingers with the specific casual expertise of someone who has done this many times before. Or it might be something you didn't expect at all. A piece of bread, actually. But the specific kind of bread made from grain that was accidentally contaminated with something that will give you both a very interesting night. The medieval world was, in ways that the history books have consistently underplayed, absolutely full of substances that altered human consciousness, not in the shadows, not in the criminal underworld, not in the specific stigmatized margins of society where modern drug culture sometimes exists, right in the open, in the fields, in the taverns, in the monastery gardens, in the physician's consulting room, in the kitchen, in the religious ceremony, and, most entertainingly, sometimes entirely by accident. This video is the complete story of what getting high looked like in the Middle Ages, and I promise you by the end of it, you will never look at a medieval peasant the same way again. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Baseline. Why medieval people needed an escape. Before we get to the specific substances, we need to understand why the medieval person was looking for an escape in the first place. Because understanding the motivation helps us understand the culture, and the culture helps us understand why certain substances were everywhere and others were nowhere. The medieval life, for the approximately 90% of the population who were agricultural workers, was physically demanding in ways that modern people have almost no reference point for. The specific caloric expenditure of a medieval agricultural labourer has been estimated at between 3,500 and 4,500 calories per day. For context, the average modern office worker burns approximately 2,000. Medieval farming was essentially competitive athletics, performed every day without weekends, with inadequate recovery nutrition and no physiotherapy when things went wrong. The pain was real and it was constant. The back problems that came from a lifetime of bending, cutting and carrying, the joint problems from sustained physical labour, the tooth pain from the specific medieval diet's effect on dental enamel, the grit from millstones that got into the flour, that got into the bread, that got into the teeth of everyone who ate it every day, the headaches, the injuries that healed imperfectly, the specific miseries of living in damp, cold environments without central heating, without proper waterproofing, without the specific modern insulation from physical discomfort that most people in wealthy countries now take entirely for granted. In this context, something that reduced pain, induced relaxation, created a sense of well-being, or made the specific grind of daily existence slightly more bearable was not a luxury. It was a practical necessity. The medieval person who reached for the flask of something strong wasn't being irresponsible. They were doing the 13th century equivalent of taking an ibuprofen after a hard day, except their options were simultaneously more varied and considerably less predictable in their effects. The other thing to understand about the medieval relationship with consciousness-altering substances is the specific role of the church. The medieval church had opinions, strong ones, detailed ones, frequently contradictory ones, about which substances were acceptable and which were not. It condemned drunkenness as a sin. It used wine as a sacrament. It maintained monastery gardens full of medicinal plants that included some of the most potently psychoactive species available in the European environment. It condemned the use of herbs in magical contexts while simultaneously having its own detailed pharmacopoeia of herbal preparations that included many of the same herbs. The result of this specific institutional ambivalence was a medieval culture around consciousness-altering substances that was neither the permissive free-for-all of the pre-Christian world nor the systematic prohibition of the modern war on drugs era. It was complicated, context-dependent, and genuinely interesting, shaped by the specific intersection of medical knowledge, theological opinion, practical necessity, and the perennial human desire to feel, at least occasionally, somewhat different from how they normally felt, and now, the substances themselves. Chapter 2. Beer and Ale. The everyday altered state. Let's start with the most obvious one, because even the most obvious one is more interesting than you might expect. Medieval people drank beer and ale in quantities that would cause significant concern at a modern health clinic, not because they were alcoholics, or at least not primarily for that reason, but because ale was safer to drink than water, provided substantial calories, and was, in the specific metabolic mathematics of the medieval labouring body, an important nutritional contribution to the day's intake. The specific distinction between ale and beer is worth establishing early because it matters for everything that follows. Ale, in the medieval context, was a fermented grain beverage brewed without hops. Beer was specifically the hopped variety. Hops arrived in England from the continent in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, and gradually displaced the unhopped ale over the following century. Before hops, what the English drank was ale, a somewhat sweeter, less stable, more rapidly spoiling fermented beverage that had to be consumed relatively quickly, and that varied enormously in its alcohol content depending on the specific brewer and the specific brewing conditions. The specific alcohol content of medieval everyday ale was generally lower than modern beer, typically in the 2 to 3% range for the small ale, that was consumed throughout the day by everyone from children to the elderly. This small ale was genuinely everyday hydration, a safer alternative to water at a time when water sources were frequently contaminated, and when the specific biological mechanism by which contaminated water caused illness was not understood, though its effects were observed well enough that the association between certain water sources and certain illnesses was common knowledge in many communities. But there was also strong ale. The specific strong ales of the medieval period, brewed with more grain, fermented longer, sometimes with additional ingredients, could reach alcohol contents comparable to modern beers, or even slightly higher. And strong ale consumed in quantity produced effects that were not merely nutritional. The medieval tavern, the alehouse, the inn, the specific social institution that was simultaneously the community social hub, the news distribution centre, and the primary venue for organised entertainment in most English towns and villages, was the place where strong ale was consumed in specifically recreational quantities. The tavern was also where the specific social dynamics of medieval drinking culture played out. The rounds of drinks, the gambling, the singing, the occasional fight, the specific atmosphere of loosened inhibitions and temporarily dissolved social hierarchies that alcohol reliably produces. The church, as noted, had very particular feelings about this. Drunkenness, ebrietas, was one of the sins that the medieval clergy condemned with particular frequency, which tells you something about how common it was. The specific pastoral concern about drunkenness was not merely moral, it was practical. Drunk people made bad decisions. Drunk people got into fights. Drunk people neglected their religious obligations. Drunk people, and this was perhaps the most concerning thing of all from the medieval theological perspective, were temporarily irrational, and irrationality was dangerous in a world where your eternal soul was always on the line. What the medieval ale culture actually looked like in practice, setting aside the theological commentary, was something remarkably close to the modern pub culture it eventually became. People gathered in convivial company. They drank moderate quantities over extended periods. They talked, told stories, played games, and generally maintained the specific social infrastructure that community life requires. Some of them drank too much and became problems for their neighbours. Most of them drank approximately as much as the specific social occasion required and went home. The specific contribution of ale and beer to the medieval altered state experience should not be underestimated, but it also shouldn't be overestimated. The daily ale of the medieval agricultural worker was not a consciousness-altering experience in any dramatic sense. It was a mild physiological modulation, a small loosening of tension, a modest nutritional contribution, a slight warming of the mood. The dramatic stuff, the experiences that would genuinely alter perception, induce visions, produce profound changes in consciousness, came from other sources, and medieval Europe had those in abundance. Chapter 3: The Monastery Garden. Where the really interesting stuff grew. You're now in a different location entirely. It is still approximately 12:30, but instead of a field, you're in the medicinal garden of a Benedictine monastery in southern Germany. The garden is meticulously organised, raised beds, clearly labelled, tended by a brother whose specific role in the monastic community is the care of medicinal plants and the preparation of the remedies that the monastery provides both to its own community and to the surrounding lay population who come to the infirmary when they are ill. The plants in this garden would cause a modern toxicologist some concern, because medieval monastic medicine, the sophisticated herbal pharmacopoeia that monks and nuns maintained and developed over centuries, drawing on classical sources like Dioscorides and Galen and adding their own extensive empirical observations, included plants that we would now classify as powerful psychoactives, controlled substances, or outright poisons. And these plants were there not because the monastics were closet drug enthusiasts, but because the specific plants that alter consciousness do so through pharmacological mechanisms that also provide genuine medical benefits when used in appropriate quantities. The key phrase there is appropriate quantities. The margin between therapeutic and toxic, between the dose that relieves pain and the dose that stops your heart, was for many of these plants extraordinarily narrow. Medieval medical practitioners navigated this margin through accumulated practical knowledge, empirical observation, and what we might charitably describe as a considerable amount of trial and error, not all of which ended happily. Let's start with the most important of the monastery garden's psychoactive residents. Henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, was one of the most widely grown and most widely used medicinal plants of the medieval period. It belongs to the nightshade family, and it contains scopolamine and hyoscyamine, powerful anticholinergic compounds that, at low doses, produce sedation and pain relief, and at higher doses produce vivid hallucinations, confusion, delirium, and a sensation that multiple historical sources describe as flight, the specific feeling of being weightless, of rising, of moving through space. The medical uses of henbane were genuine and well documented. It was used for pain relief, for insomnia, for the specific agony of toothache, and, in the practice of medieval surgery, as part of the anaesthetic, preparations that medieval surgeons used before they operated on patients. The soporific sponge, a cloth or sponge soaked in a preparation of henbane, opium, mandrake, and other sedative herbs, was a documented medieval anaesthetic technique, held under the patient's nose to induce unconsciousness before surgery. This is genuinely impressive. Medieval surgery was conducted without general anaesthesia in the modern sense, but with a set of pharmacological tools, heavily weighted toward anticholinergic and opiate compounds, that could produce sufficient sedation for certain procedures. The fact that this worked is remarkable. The fact that it occasionally worked too well, producing unconsciousness from which patients did not recover, is also documented. The hallucinogenic properties of henbane were known, written about and used in specific contexts. The specific application that most captured the historical and anthropological imagination was the use of henbane, along with other nightshade compounds, in the preparations associated with the witch trial confessions of the 14th and 15th centuries. We will return to this in considerable detail later, because it is one of the most fascinating and most complex stories in the history of psychoactive substances. Mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, was perhaps the most mythologized plant in all of medieval pharmacology, and the mythology was not entirely separate from the pharmacology. Mandrake contains tropane alkaloids, the same general class of compounds as henbane, but in concentrations that make it considerably more potent and considerably more dangerous. It was used medicinally as an analgesic and sedative, and its specific hallucinogenic properties at higher doses were well known. The mythology surrounding mandrake was spectacular and specifically medieval. The root, which sometimes takes a vaguely humanoid shape, was said to scream when pulled from the earth, a scream that would kill anyone who heard it. The proper method of harvesting mandrake, according to multiple medieval sources, was to tie a dog to the root and then block your own ears. The dog pulled the root, heard the scream, died from it, and you had your mandrake. Whether medieval practitioners actually did this, or whether the story was more a way of keeping mandrake harvesting as a specialised and therefore valuable profession, is an interesting question that historians have debated without reaching definitive conclusions. What is certain is that mandrake was taken seriously, as medicine, as magical ingredient, as fertility charm, and as a substance whose specific effects on consciousness were recognised and recorded by people who had clearly had direct experience of them. Deadly nightshade, Atropa belladonna, completed the medieval nightshade triumvirate. Its name tells you most of what you need to know. Deadly is self-explanatory, and belladonna, Italian for beautiful woman, refers to the specific cosmetic use of nightshade drops to dilate pupils, a practice that Renaissance women used for aesthetic effect, and that causes temporary blurred vision and photosensitivity as side effects. The plant contains atropine, a compound that, in medicinal doses, is still used today in ophthalmology and cardiology, and which in higher doses produces delirium, hallucinations, and potentially fatal cardiovascular effects. Medieval medical use of belladonna was extensive and required considerable skill, because the therapeutic window, the range between an effective dose and a lethal one, was narrow. The specific expertise of the practitioners who used it regularly was real, developed through training and observation, and formed part of the proprietary knowledge that distinguished the skilled medical practitioner from the amateur. Chapter 4. Opium, the ancient painkiller that never went away. Medieval Europe inherited from classical antiquity a relationship with opium that was centuries old, pharmacologically sophisticated, and embedded in medical practice in ways that were not meaningfully different from how opiates are used in modern medicine, except without the regulatory framework that modern opioid prescription involves. Opium, the dried latex of the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, was the most powerful analgesic available to medieval medicine, and had been in continuous use in Western medicine since at least the ancient Greeks. Dioscorides described it in the 1st century CE. Galen used it extensively. The Arab physician Avicenna, whose canon of medicine was the standard medical textbook in European universities from the 11th through the 17th century, had an extensive and sophisticated understanding of opium's properties, its uses and its risks, including its addictive potential. The opium poppy was cultivated in medieval Europe, in monastery gardens and in the gardens of medical practitioners for direct medical use. The specific preparations available varied by region and practitioner, but included laudanum, a preparation of opium dissolved in alcohol, later formalised by Paracelsus in the 16th century but with antecedents in medieval medical practice, was used for pain relief, for inducing sleep, and for managing the specific symptoms of various diseases including dysentery, where opium's effect of slowing intestinal motility was genuinely therapeutically useful. Theriac, one of the most complex and most prestigious pharmaceutical preparations of the medieval world, was a compound medicine that typically contained opium alongside dozens of other ingredients, all combined in proportions specified by a classical recipe that traced back to the Roman physician Galen. Theriac was the universal antidote, the cure-all, the prestigious preparation that high-status practitioners used for their high-status patients. It was also genuinely effective at pain relief, courtesy of its opium content. The specific medical relationship with opium in the medieval period was therefore sophisticated, generally appropriate, and embedded in a tradition of learning and practice that recognized both the drug's therapeutic value and its potential for harm. Medieval physicians wrote about opium addiction, the specific pattern of escalating use and withdrawal symptoms that regular opium consumption produces, with clinical accuracy that suggests real familiarity with the phenomenon. What the medieval opium situation did not involve was the specific recreational culture that later centuries would develop around opiates. Medieval opium use was primarily medical, genuinely, not euphemistically. The specific social and cultural context that would eventually produce opium dens in 19th century China and subsequently in European port cities had not yet developed in medieval Europe. People used opium when they were in pain, when they needed surgery, or when they needed sleep, and the physician who prescribed it was operating within a coherent medical framework that took the drug seriously, as both a therapeutic resource and a potential danger. The poppy itself, both the opium poppy and the ornamental varieties that were widely grown, appeared in medieval gardens, in medieval art, in medieval poetry, and in the specific iconography of sleep and death that ran through the period's visual culture. The association between poppies, sleep, and death was as present in medieval symbolic vocabulary as it is in modern cultural memory of, say, the poppy fields of The Wizard of Oz. This was not accidental. It reflected genuine pharmacological knowledge encoded in cultural form. Chapter 5. Cannabis. The plant that was everywhere and being used for something else. Medieval Europe had hemp, lots of it. Cannabis sativa was one of the most economically important plants in medieval Europe, cultivated extensively across the continent for its extraordinarily useful fibre. Hemp fibre made rope, it made sailcloth, it made the specific high-quality paper that was gradually displacing parchment as the primary writing material. It made the rough linen-like fabric that formed the everyday clothing of a substantial proportion of the European population. Hemp was, in short, an agricultural staple of the First Order. And here is where the story gets interesting. The distinction between hemp grown for fibre, which in modern industrial hemp varieties contains very low concentrations of THC, the primary psychoactive compound in cannabis, and cannabis grown for its psychoactive properties is real, but was considerably less sharp in the medieval period than modern industrial breeding has made it. Medieval hemp likely had higher THC content than modern industrial varieties, though considerably lower than modern drug-type cannabis. Whether this was sufficient to produce noticeable psychoactive effects when processed and consumed in certain ways is a question that the historical record does not resolve with complete clarity. What the historical record does confirm is that the psychoactive properties of cannabis were known in medieval Europe. The knowledge came from multiple sources. From classical texts, Dioscorides described cannabis and its properties. From Arab medical scholarship, Avicenna wrote about hashish and its effects. And from the specific trade routes that connected medieval Europe to the Islamic world where cannabis preparations were more extensively used. The specific Groot ale tradition is one of the most debated aspects of medieval cannabis history. Groot was the mixture of herbs used to flavour and preserve ale before hops became dominant in the brewing tradition. The specific composition of Groot varied by region and by brewer, but typically included bog myrtle, yarrow and wild rosemary, and in some documented formulations potentially cannabis. The inclusion of cannabis in Groot is contested in the historical literature. Some researchers have argued that specific Groot herbs with cannabis-like names in medieval botanical texts refer to cannabis. Others argue that the identification is incorrect. The debate has not been fully resolved. What is clear is that some Groot ales included ingredients with psychoactive properties beyond simple alcohol, and that the specific tradition of herbed ales produced experiences different from simple beer. The specific word hashish appears in medieval European text primarily in the context of describing Islamic practices, and sometimes in the context of the stories about the assassins, the Nizari Ismaili sect whose name some medieval European sources connected to hashish, though this etymology is historically contested and probably inaccurate. The stories that circulated in medieval Europe about the assassins and their supposed use of hashish to motivate their agents were almost certainly largely fabricated. But they did introduce the concept of cannabis as a powerful consciousness-altering substance to European audiences in the 13th and 14th centuries. The medical use of cannabis in medieval Europe was genuine but limited compared to the more extensive use in Islamic medical tradition. Hemp seeds, the nutritionally rich seeds of the cannabis plant, were used medicinally. Hemp oil was used topically. Various preparations using different parts of the plant were recorded in medieval herbals. But the specific smoking or ingestion of cannabis for its psychoactive properties was not documented as a widespread European practice in the medieval period, in the way that it was in some parts of Asia and the Middle East. The picture that emerges is of a plant that was everywhere, but whose most famous properties were mostly used elsewhere. A psychoactive substance that sat in the background of medieval European culture, known about, occasionally used in specific medical contexts, but not yet having developed the specific cultural forms that would make cannabis use a recognised social phenomenon. That would come later. The medieval period was, in this respect, a prologue. Chapter 6. ergot, the accidental psychedelic that changed history. Now we arrive at the most consequential and the most genuinely alarming entry in the medieval psychedelic pharmacopoeia. You have not chosen to get high. You're a peasant in the Rhine Valley in approximately 994 CE. You're eating the bread that you always eat, rye bread, the staple grain of the region, ground from this year's harvest. The bread looks normal. It smells normal. You have been eating this bread for weeks, and then one morning the burning starts. It begins in your hands and feet, a specific intense burning sensation as if your extremities are on fire, followed by the specific visual disturbance of colours becoming too bright and shapes beginning to shift. Then come the convulsions, then come the visions. You have not encountered a demon, though in the specific theological vocabulary of 994 CE, a demon is the most immediately available explanation for what is happening to you. You are not possessed, though the specific behaviour you are now exhibiting, the involuntary movements, the visions, the burning, resembles what your community's religious framework would describe as possession. What you have done is eat bread contaminated with ergot. Ergot, Claviceps purpurea, is a parasitic fungus that infects rye and other cereals, replacing the grain kernels with dark, hard fungal structures called sclerotia. When these sclerotia are ground with the grain and baked into bread, the heat does not fully destroy the ergot alkaloids they contain. Those alkaloids, a complex mixture that includes compounds closely related to LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, which was actually synthesized from ergot alkaloids in 1938, survive in the bread and are consumed by whoever eats it. The effects of ergot poisoning, ergotism, came in two main forms. The convulsive form produced the specific neurological symptoms, the hallucinations, the convulsions, the specific altered state of consciousness that ergot alkaloids produce when they interact with serotonin receptors in the brain. The gangrenous form produced vasoconstriction, the specific narrowing of blood vessels that cut off circulation to the extremities, causing them to turn black and fall off, which is why the disease was also known as St. Anthony's Fire. Medieval Europe experienced documented ergot epidemics at various points throughout the period. The epidemic of 994 CE in the Rhine Valley was documented as a mass poisoning that killed thousands. Similar events occurred at other times and places throughout the medieval period, with the specific pattern, the burning, the convulsions, the visions, the gangrene, recorded in chronicles and medical texts with enough consistency to allow confident retrospective diagnosis. The theological interpretation of ergot epidemics was, from the perspective of the people experiencing them, entirely rational given their worldview. Mass visions, involuntary convulsions, burning limbs, and collective altered states of consciousness are not the kind of thing that the medieval material world could explain without recourse to supernatural causation. Demonic possession, divine punishment, and the specific intercession of the devil in human affairs were the available explanatory frameworks, and the symptoms fit these frameworks well enough that they were applied consistently. The specific connection between ergot contamination and some of the episodes of mass hysteria, bewitchment, and collective visionary experience documented in the medieval period has been a significant topic in the historical literature since the 1970s, when the researcher Linda Caporael proposed that the Salem witch trials of 1692, technically outside the medieval period but relevant to the broader discussion, might have been triggered by ergot poisoning. The specific agricultural conditions in Salem in the year before the trials, the wet, warm growing season that promotes ergot growth, the rye crop that was the primary grain of the affected area, were consistent with this hypothesis. The Salem hypothesis has been extensively debated and is not universally accepted, but the broader point, that ergot contamination could produce genuinely dramatic collective experiences that the communities experiencing them would interpret in supernatural terms, is well established. The specific epidemics of what medieval sources called St. Anthony's Fire were real, were documented, and produced exactly the kinds of experiences that could generate lasting cultural and religious responses. There is also the specific and rather unsettling possibility that some of the documented medieval reports of divine visions, mystical experiences, and miraculous phenomena, the specific category of religious experience that was extremely important in medieval culture, and that formed the basis of numerous saints' cults, may have had ergot as a contributing factor in specific cases. This is not to reduce medieval mysticism to pharmacology. but the specific pattern of mass visions following years of poor grain storage, the specific geographic clustering of certain miracle reports in areas with rye cultivation, and the specific physiological descriptions in some mystical texts are suggestive enough to warrant serious scholarly attention. The specific lesson that Ergot teaches us about medieval consciousness-altering substances is the most important one in this entire video. The most powerful psychedelic experiences of the medieval period were mostly not chosen. They were accidents, the specific consequence of a fungal contamination that the medieval world had no way to detect, no way to prevent reliably, and no framework to understand as anything other than supernatural intervention. When we talk about getting high in medieval times, we need to include the involuntary experiences, because for many medieval people, the most profound altered states of consciousness they ever experienced were not the result of any deliberate choice. Chapter 7. Mead, Wine, and the Sacred Substances. Before we move into the more exotic territory, we need to give proper attention to two substances whose role in medieval consciousness was simultaneously the most widespread, the most culturally complex, and the most institutionally sanctioned: mead and wine. Mead, fermented honey, is among the oldest alcoholic beverages in human history, with evidence of its production going back at least 9,000 years. In the specific cultural context of Northern Europe, mead carried a weight of cultural and mythological significance that went far beyond its status as a fermented drink. The specific Norse and Anglo-Saxon mead culture, the mead hall as the centre of social and political life, the sharing of mead as a ritual act of community and loyalty, the specific role of the Valkyrie as chooser of the slain, who served mead in Valhalla, embedded this drink in the deepest structures of the cultural imagination. Medieval mead was frequently not simple fermented honey. The specific tradition of metheglins, herbed meads, flavoured and preserved with specific botanical additions, produced a category of mead that could include a range of medically and psychoactively interesting additions. Henbane meads, mead containing wormwood, which contains the psychoactive compound thujon, mead with added mushrooms. The specific metheglins documented in medieval and early modern recipe books contain ingredients that would raise interesting pharmacological questions at a modern toxicology conference. Wine was the most culturally and theologically loaded of all medieval beverages. For the Catholic Church that dominated medieval European religious life, wine was not merely a drink. It was a sacrament, the specific medium of the Eucharist, the substance that was, according to Catholic doctrine, transformed into the blood of Christ during the Mass. The theological significance of wine created a specific cultural framework in which wine consumption was simultaneously sacred in the sacramental context and potentially sinful in the context of drunkenness. This specific tension between wine as sacred substance and wine as source of intoxication produced a medieval wine culture of considerable complexity. Monasteries were among the most important wine producers in medieval Europe, not merely because of the theological connection, but because wine preservation was better understood in monastic contexts with access to classical technical knowledge, and because the monastery's stable agricultural base and literate administrative culture made long-term viticultural investment practical. The wines of the medieval period were, in many cases, quite different from modern wines. They were typically stronger because the specific practices of adding honey or reducing the must to increase sugar content were common. They were often mulled with spices, warming, sweetening, and adding psychoactively interesting compounds in the process, and they were frequently consumed in combinations with other herbs and medicines that modified their effects in ways that the specific concept of wine doesn't fully capture. The specific tradition of medicinal wines, preparations in which herbs were steeped in wine to extract their active compounds, was one of the primary pharmaceutical practices of medieval medicine. Wormwood wine, poppy wine, henbane wine. The specific preparations documented in medieval medical texts used wine as both a solvent and a vehicle, combining its own psychoactive properties with those of whatever herbs had been added. The result was a pharmacological landscape in which the category of wine encompassed substances with a considerably wider range of effects than the modern category suggests. Chapter 8. The Wise Woman, who actually knew what they were doing and why the church was terrified of them. There was someone in the village who knew. Not the physician. The physician, in most medieval communities, was a distant urban professional whose consultation required the specific expense of the journey and the fee that the agricultural labourer could not readily afford. Not the monk, the monastery's infirmary served its own community and the more serious cases that the rural population brought to its door, but it was not the everyday medical resource of the village. The person who knew, in most medieval rural communities, was the specific woman, or occasionally man, whose practical knowledge of the local plant pharmacopoeia had been accumulated through training, through observation, and through the specific empirical tradition that passed from practitioner to practitioner, through the specific oral transmission of the knowledge that the written record almost never preserved. The wise woman, the cunning woman, the herbalist, the village healer, the specific figure who occupied the intersection of the practical, the medical, and the supernatural in medieval rural communities, was one of the most important and most systematically under-acknowledged figures in the medieval social world. Her knowledge was real. Her services were genuinely needed. Her relationship with the specific plant pharmacopoeia of her region was often more practically sophisticated than anything the university-trained physician possessed, because she knew not the classical authors, but the specific plants that grew in the specific fields of the specific landscape she inhabited, and she had spent her life learning what they did. The specific knowledge that the wise woman possessed was the knowledge of the dose, the single most important variable in the pharmacology of the medieval plant pharmacopoeia. The plants we have been discussing, the henbane, the mandrake, the belladonna, the various opium preparations, had specific therapeutic properties at specific doses and specific lethal properties at doses only moderately higher. The knowledge of where the line was, empirically established through the specific bitter experience of the tradition she had inherited, was the knowledge that made the difference between the healer and the poisoner. This distinction between healer and poisoner was precisely the distinction that the medieval legal and theological tradition was most anxious about, and the anxiety was not irrational. The same plants, the same preparations, the same knowledge, the specific intentions of the practitioner and the specific quantities used were the only differences between the preparation that cured and the preparation that killed, and the specific verification of intention was as impossible in the medieval period as it is today. The wise woman's preparations for pain relief were the specific practical medical resource that the agricultural community relied on. The tooth pulled without henbane-based numbing was the tooth pulled in the full specific experience of medieval dental pain, which anyone who has had an untreated abscess has some partial understanding of. The wound dressed without antimicrobial herb preparations was the wound that festered in a world before antibiotics. The labouring woman attended without the specific analgesic and contractile herbs that the midwifery tradition employed was the labouring woman experiencing the full, unmanaged pain of a process that could and regularly did kill. The specific preparations for sleep were another central part of the wise woman's practice. Sleep, genuine, adequate sleep, is a medical necessity that the specific physical discomfort of medieval life regularly disrupted. The joint pain that woke the elderly farmer at 3 a.m, the infected wound whose pain prevented sleep during the critical healing period, the specific anxiety of the medieval person facing genuine existential uncertainty, the harvest failure, the sick child, the approaching winter, that the body translated into the specific wakefulness of the deeply stressed. The preparations that produced sleep were not luxuries, they were medicines. The specific psychoactive knowledge that the wise woman possessed extended beyond the therapeutic to the ritual, to the specific preparations that her community used for the specific altered states that the ritual occasion required. This is the territory where the medical and the magical meet, where the specific pharmacology of the plant preparation intersects with the specific cultural expectations of the person consuming it, and where the historian must be careful not to reduce the rich complexity of medieval magical practice to the pharmacology while also not pretending the pharmacology was absent. The ritual preparations, the specific substances consumed or applied during the ceremonies that the pre-Christian traditions maintained alongside and beneath the official Christianity of the medieval period, were among the most closely guarded knowledge of the wise woman's practice. They were also among the most dangerous to possess. The specific knowledge of how to produce and administer a preparation that induced visions was simultaneously the most powerful and the most threatening knowledge available in the medieval social world, and the specific institutional response to this knowledge was the response that eventually produced the witch trials. The wise woman's relationship with the church was the relationship of the parallel institution with the dominant one, the local, practical, empirically grounded knowledge tradition, operating alongside the theological and textual tradition of the church, serving many of the same functions through different means and generating the specific institutional anxiety of the dominant institution toward the parallel one that it could not fully control. The Church condemned certain practices. It continued to need the services that those practices provided. The specific tension between condemnation and dependence shaped the relationship between the official religious structure and the folk practice tradition throughout the medieval period, and the specific resolution of that tension, the witch hunt, the burning, the systematic effort to destroy the knowledge tradition of the wise woman, was one of the defining catastrophes of the late medieval and early modern period. But that resolution came at the end of the medieval period, not the beginning. For most of the centuries we are examining, the wise woman practiced, the village used her services, and the specific knowledge she carried, the knowledge of the dose, the knowledge of the preparation, the knowledge of the plant and its properties, was the knowledge that kept people alive, and occasionally, deliberately or accidentally, transported them somewhere quite different from where they normally were. Chapter 9. The Flying Ointment. The most fascinating and most debated substance in medieval history. We need to talk about the ointment. The specific preparation known variously as the witch's flying ointment, the unguentum sabbati, the witch's salve, the substance that the witch trial testimonies of the 14th through 17th centuries described as enabling witches to fly to the Sabbath, to transform into animals, to perform the specific supernatural feats that the witch trial accusations attributed to them, is one of the most genuinely interesting objects in the entire history of psychoactive substances. It is interesting not because witches actually flew to Sabbaths. They did not. Flight as a physical phenomenon was not occurring. The specific confessed experiences of trial witnesses and accused witches, the sense of flight, the arrival at the Sabbath gathering, the specific encounters with supernatural figures, the specific vivid experiences of the gathering itself, were not descriptions of physical events. They were descriptions of pharmacologically induced experiences. And here is where the specific pharmacology becomes extraordinarily interesting. The flying ointment, in its various described forms, was typically a topically applied preparation, rubbed onto the skin, applied to specific body parts. The historical sources, many of which were written by male inquisitors with specific prurient interests, frequently specified that it was applied to the genitals or the armpits, absorbed through the skin rather than ingested. The specific plants most commonly identified in both the trial accounts and the medieval botanical literature as ingredients in such preparations were exactly the plants we have already discussed: henbane, belladonna, mandrake, and sometimes datura, a related nightshade from which these could have been confused or substituted. The pharmacology of transdermal absorption of tropane alkaloids, the specific mechanism by which the anticholinergic compounds in these plants could enter the bloodstream through the skin, is real. The skin is not perfectly impermeable to lipid-soluble compounds, and the alkaloids in the nightshade family are lipid-soluble enough to be absorbed transdermally, particularly through mucous membranes or areas of thin skin. The specific physiological properties of the armpits and genitals, areas with extensive blood supply and mucous membrane tissue, make them specifically effective absorption sites for transdermal drug delivery. The specific effects that the tropane alkaloids produce at the concentrations achievable through transdermal absorption are the effects that the witch trial testimonies describe. The sensation of flight, the specific overwhelming feeling of movement, of rising, of being transported through space, is documented as a specific effect of scopolamine and related compounds at specific doses. The vivid hallucinations of gathering, of strange company, of supernatural figures, these are documented effects of anticholinergic alkaloids. The specific amnesia that often followed the experience, the inability to clearly recall what had happened during the period of the drug's action, is another documented property of scopolamine, which is why the compound has been investigated and misused as a component of so-called truth serums and date rape drugs. The specific cultural framework into which these pharmacologically induced experiences were placed, the framework of the witch's Sabbath, the diabolical gathering, the specific meeting with the devil, was the framework that the person experiencing the drug provided. The pharmacology produced the experience of flight, of meeting, of supernatural company. The medieval cultural imagination provided the specific content: the devil, the Sabbath, the specific culturally defined encounters that the dreamlike state of the tropane alkaloid experience would populate with the imagery most available in the specific cultural mind of the medieval person undergoing it. This is one of the most important insights in the entire history of psychoactive substances, the set and setting principle, the specific psychological and cultural context in which a drug is taken, which determines much of the specific content of the experience the drug produces, operating in its most dramatic possible form. The same pharmacological event, the specific activation of anticholinergic receptors in the brain, produced different specific experiences depending on the specific cultural framework of the person experiencing it. A medieval woman who applied the flying ointment in the specific context of the folk magical tradition that used it had an experience populated with the specific imagery of that tradition. A modern researcher who was dosed with scopolamine without knowing it would have an experience populated with the specific imagery of their own cultural world. The specific researchers who investigated the flying ointment most thoroughly in the 20th century, particularly Will Erik Purkert, the German folklorist who in 1960 reportedly formulated and tested a version of the historical recipe on himself and a colleague, described experiences consistent with the historical accounts. The sensation of wild flight, of attendance at a gathering, of vivid hallucinations lasting approximately 12 to 20 hours, followed by exhaustion and partial amnesia. The specific replication of the historical experience through the specific pharmacological mechanism that the historical preparation would have employed is among the most compelling evidence that the flying ointment was a real thing, with real pharmacological properties, producing real, pharmacologically induced experiences in the people who used it. The specific social function of the flying ointment in the communities that used it, the specific role it played in the ritual life of the folk magical tradition, is harder to reconstruct. The trial accounts are contaminated by the specific agendas of the inquisitors who elicited them. The genuine practitioners who used the preparations were not producing written records of their activities. What can be said with confidence is that the specific knowledge of such preparations existed, that the specific pharmacology supports the effectiveness of the claimed preparations, and that the specific experiences described in both confessions and later research accounts are consistent with the known effects of the compounds involved. What is also worth saying is that the specific persecution of the people who possessed and used this knowledge, the specific burning of the witches who are accused of flying ointment use, was the specific institutional destruction of one of the most sophisticated empirical pharmacological traditions in European history. The women who knew how to compound and use the flying ointment were also the women who knew how to relieve pain, induce sleep, and manage the medical emergencies of their communities. The destruction of one knowledge tradition was the destruction of the other, and the specific public health cost of the witch trials, measured in the knowledge that was burned alongside the bodies, is one of the most significant and least discussed aspects of the persecution. Chapter 10. The Mushroom Question. Did medieval people use psilocybin? This chapter requires more honesty about uncertainty than the previous ones. The question of whether medieval Europeans used psilocybin-containing mushrooms, the specific psychedelic fungi that produce profound alterations in consciousness through their action on serotonin receptors, is a question that the historical record does not answer definitively, and the specific intellectual honesty that this video aspires to requires acknowledging that uncertainty clearly before presenting the evidence that makes the question interesting. The psilocybin mushrooms grow in Europe. Psilocybe semilanceata, the liberty cap, is native to northern European grasslands and is one of the most widely distributed psilocybin-containing species in the world. It grows in Britain, in Ireland, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Scandinavia. It has been growing there since before the medieval period. The specific ecological conditions that it prefers, damp grasslands grazed by livestock, were precisely the conditions of medieval European agriculture. The liberty cap was present in the medieval European landscape in large quantities. The question is whether medieval people knew what it did and used it deliberately. The specific evidence is circumstantial and contested. The most famous piece of evidence in the popular literature, the specific carved imagery in the Norman doorway at Plencoreau Abbey in France, which some researchers in the 1950s and 1960s identified as depicting the tree of knowledge as an Amanita muscaria mushroom, has been largely rejected by mainstream art historians who argue it is a specific conventional representation of a tree in a medieval artistic style rather than a mushroom. The specific claim that Amanita muscaria was a sacramental substance at the centre of European religious practice, promoted most influentially by Gordon Wasson in his 1968 book Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality, is disputed in the scholarly literature with good reason. The Amanita muscaria case is worth addressing specifically because it has been so prominent in popular discussions of medieval psychedelics. Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric, the red mushroom with white spots of fairy tale iconography, does contain psychoactive compounds, ibotenic acid and muscimol, but its effects are distinctly different from those of psilocybin mushrooms and considerably less predictable. The specific experience of Amanita muscaria ingestion, described in multiple first-person accounts, is more often bizarre and unpleasant than the transcendent experience that the popular mythology suggests. The specific evidence for its deliberate sacramental use in medieval Europe is weak. The psilocybin mushrooms are a different matter, though the evidence is still not conclusive. The specific botanical knowledge that medieval herbalists possessed, their detailed familiarity with the plant and fungal life of their specific landscapes, almost certainly included knowledge of the liberty cap and its effects. The specific pattern of livestock grazing that would have brought medieval agricultural workers into regular contact with liberty cap patches in autumn meadows was the specific, occupational pattern of medieval pastoral farming. It is very difficult to argue that medieval Europeans were uniquely ignorant of a mushroom that grew in their fields and whose effects, once encountered by any member of the population, would have been recognised as quite remarkable. The specific silence of the written record on this topic could mean one of several things. It could mean that psilocybin mushrooms were not used because if they were, someone would have written about them. It could mean that they were used, but not in a way that attracted the specific institutional attention of the church or the law that would generate a documentary record. It could mean that they were used, but that the knowledge was part of the specific oral tradition of the folk practice community that the written record consistently fails to document. The specific evidence from the artistic record is interesting but inconclusive. The detailed investigation of medieval manuscript illuminations by researchers, including Andy Letcher, whose book Shroom provides perhaps the most rigorous academic treatment of the European psychedelic mushroom question, suggests that the specific mushroom imagery in medieval art is not consistently interpretable as depictions of psychedelic experience or sacramental mushroom use, and that many of the claimed depictions are more accurately understood as conventional artistic representations of the fungi that appeared in the medieval natural world. What can be said with specific confidence is this: the pharmacological capacity for psilocybin mushroom experience was present in the medieval European landscape. The specific agricultural and pastoral practices of the medieval period would have produced regular accidental contact between the population and psychedelic mushrooms. The specific folk botanical knowledge tradition was sophisticated enough to have identified the properties of plants and fungi that produced distinctive effects on consciousness. Whether this produced a deliberate use tradition is genuinely uncertain. Whether it produced accidental experiences that were interpreted within the specific supernatural framework of the medieval worldview is essentially certain. The specific mystical experiences of the medieval period, the visions, the ecstasies, the specific encounters with divine figures that the hagiographic literature records in considerable detail, were understood by those who experienced them and by those who witnessed them in purely supernatural terms. The specific pharmacological contribution of the landscape, the ergot contamination, the possible mushroom encounters, the possible herbal preparations, is an undercurrent in this tradition whose specific magnitude cannot be precisely determined, but whose presence should be acknowledged. Chapter 11. The Tavern. The specific social world of medieval intoxication. You have left the field. You have left the monastery garden. You have left the wise woman's cottage. You are now in the alehouse. The medieval alehouse was not the pub of the Victorian imagination. The specific cosy interior of dark wood and polished brass, and the specific atmosphere of the Anglophone drinking tradition that the 19th century formalised and the 20th century mythologized. It was typically a private house, the home of the alewife, the woman who brewed ale commercially and sold it from her own premises, with a specific minimal commercial infrastructure. the ale stake, a pole or branch hung outside the door to indicate that ale was available, the benches and tables of the domestic interior, and the specific social atmosphere of the gathering place that the village or town community used as its primary venue for organised sociability. The alewife was a specific and important figure in the medieval commercial landscape. Ale brewing, before it was taken over by the specific large commercial breweries of the later medieval and early modern period, was primarily a domestic industry, and the women who ran alehouses were operating genuine small businesses whose regulation by the local assize of ale, the medieval price and quality control system for ale, placed them within the formal commercial structure of the community. The specific social function of the alehouse in the medieval community was broader than its function as a drinking venue. It was the specific primary news distribution centre in communities without newspapers. It was the venue for the specific informal business negotiations that the commercial community conducted over drink. It was the specific location of the music, the storytelling, the game playing, and the general recreation that the medieval community's limited entertainment options made essential. And it was the specific place where the social hierarchies of the working week were partially dissolved by the specific chemistry of the ale itself. The specific dissolution of hierarchy that the alehouse produced was one of the things that made it simultaneously attractive to its customers and suspicious to the authorities. In the alehouse, the serf sat beside the free labourer. The craftsman drank with the farmer. The specific rigid social stratification of the medieval world, the hierarchy of lord and peasant, of free and unfree, of the various gradations of status that the feudal system maintained with considerable rigidity in every other context, became, in the alehouse, at least partially permeable. The church's specific concern about alehouses was not merely about the drunkenness that happened within them, though drunkenness was a genuine concern, and the specific pattern of sin that drunkenness facilitated was a consistent topic of the pastoral literature. The church was concerned about the alehouse as an alternative social institution, a space that operated outside the specific moral supervision of the parish, that gathered people in groups whose activities the priest could not monitor, and that occasionally served as the venue for the specific folk practices and celebrations that the church's official religion had not fully displaced. The specific calendar of the medieval alehouse tracked the specific calendar of the community's celebration, the harvest ale, the church ale, the wedding ale, in ways that connected the drinking tradition to the specific seasonal and social rhythms of the community's life. The church ale was one of the most important of these, a specific fundraising event in which the parish brewed and sold ale, using the proceeds for church maintenance or charitable purposes. The church ale was simultaneously a religious institution and a community drinking event, a specific, seamless fusion of the sacred and the social that the later Protestant tradition would find deeply alarming. The food that accompanied drinking in the medieval alehouse was the food of the specific commercial establishment's limited repertoire: bread, cheese, the occasional preserved meat, the specific, simple foods that required minimal preparation and that provided the caloric substrate for the alcohol being consumed. The specific nutritional importance of the food and drink combination, the slowing of alcohol absorption by the presence of food in the stomach, was understood empirically by the alehouse culture without requiring any specific biochemical knowledge of the mechanism. The specific games played in the medieval alehouse were the games of the specific recreational culture of the period. Dice, illegal in many jurisdictions throughout the medieval period because of the gambling they facilitated, and therefore pervasive in exactly the underground venues where gambling happened without official oversight. Bowls, the specific card games that arrived in Europe from the East in the 14th century. The specific verbal games, riddles, word contests, the storytelling competitions whose specific traditions fed into the literary culture of the period. The medieval alehouse was, in its specific, noisy, smoky, overcrowded way, a cultural institution. Chapter 12. Theriac and the Apothecary. The professional drug trade of the medieval world. The medieval world had a pharmaceutical industry, not the specific global pharmaceutical industry of the modern world, not the multinational corporations, the clinical trial infrastructure, the regulatory agencies, the patent system that defines modern pharmaceutical commerce, but a genuine, structured, commercial and professional system for the production, distribution, and sale of medical preparations that included the most potent psychoactive substances available in the medieval pharmacopoeia. The apothecary, the specific professional figure of the medieval pharmaceutical trade, was the person who occupied the space between the physician who diagnosed and prescribed and the patient who needed treatment. The apothecary stocked and prepared the compounds that the physician prescribed, and in practice also dispensed directly to customers who came without a prescription, based on their own considerable practical knowledge of what preparations addressed what symptoms. The medieval apothecary's stock was the specific material expression of the period's pharmaceutical knowledge, and examining it is like examining a pharmacological museum. The dried plants and plant parts, the herbs, the roots, the bark, the seeds, from both local and distant sources, the specific imported spices that were simultaneously culinary and medical ingredients, the mineral preparations, the animal-derived medicines, and, at the premium end of the stock, the theriac. Theriac. We have mentioned it before, but it deserves specific treatment here because it was the most important compound medicine in the medieval pharmacopoeia, and one of the most genuinely fascinating objects in the history of pharmacology. The recipe for theriac claimed descent from the court physician of the Roman Emperor Nero, Andromachus, who compiled it in the 1st century CE, and specified between 64 and 80 individual ingredients depending on the specific version, combined in specific proportions, processed through specific methods, and aged for a minimum of 12 years before use. The list of theriac ingredients was itself a catalogue of the medieval pharmacopoeia's most prized and most exotic materials: opium, the core active ingredient present in substantial quantities; viper flesh, included on the specific humoral theory that the venom of the viper could be transformed into its antidote through proper processing; long pepper, ginger, cinnamon, and numerous other spices; dried plant materials from across the known world. The specific combination of these ingredients, and the specific aging process that allowed the components to interact chemically over time, produced a preparation whose specific effects were primarily those of its opium content, supplemented by whatever pharmacologically active compounds the other ingredients contributed. The production of genuine theriac was a public ceremony in the specific cities that had the right to produce it: Venice, Bologna, Genoa, performed by licensed apothecaries before municipal officials and assembled physicians, using verified ingredients of specified quality according to the specific publicly witnessed recipe. The specific ceremonial character of the theriac production was not merely theatrical, it was the quality control system of the period. The public witnessing of the production process was the specific mechanism for guaranteeing that the expensive, complex preparation had actually been made to the required standard. The theriac trade was substantial enough to generate specific commercial fraud that the regulatory system was designed to prevent. Counterfeit theriac, preparations sold as genuine theriac but made with cheaper, inferior or substitute ingredients, was a consistent commercial problem in the medieval pharmaceutical market, and the specific public production ceremonies were the specific institutional response to this problem. The physician who prescribed genuine Venetian theriac was prescribing a product whose quality had been publicly certified. The patient who received something labelled theriac but produced by a less scrupulous apothecary was receiving something whose specific pharmacological properties were unpredictable. The specific smaller establishments that the apothecary maintained alongside the prestige preparations were the establishments of the everyday pharmaceutical trade, the specific headache preparations, the fever reducers, the specific sleep aids and pain preparations that the ordinary customer came to purchase for their ordinary complaints. These preparations drew on the specific local plant pharmacopoeia as well as on the imported materials, and the specific quality and potency of these everyday preparations varied with the specific knowledge and honesty of the apothecary. The spice trade and the pharmaceutical trade were not, in the medieval period, clearly distinguished. The specific spices that the apothecary sold for pharmaceutical purposes and the specific spices that the merchant sold for culinary purposes were often the same materials: ginger, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, differing only in the specific application to which they were put. The medieval apothecary was often also a spice merchant, the specific overlap reflecting the genuine continuity between the culinary and pharmaceutical traditions in the period's material culture. Chapter 13: Pilgrims, Crusaders, and the Introduction of New Substances. The medieval world was not as insular as the popular imagination suggests. The specific geographic isolation of the medieval peasant, who might live and die within a 20-mile radius of there, birthplace, was real. But it was accompanied by specific large-scale population movements that crossed enormous distances and carried specific material culture, including specific psychoactive substances from one part of the known world to another. The Crusades, the pilgrimages, the specific merchant routes that connected northern Europe to the Mediterranean and through it to the Islamic world, to Central Asia, to the farthest reaches of the known world. The Crusades, the specific military campaigns of the 11th through 13th centuries that took hundreds of thousands of European soldiers to the eastern Mediterranean, were one of the most significant vectors for the introduction of new substances into European culture. The specific material culture of the Islamic world that the Crusaders encountered was in many respects more sophisticated than their own, and the specific exchange of material knowledge that occurred in the Crusader states of the Levant was one of the most important cultural transfers of the medieval period. The specific substances that this encounter introduced or reintroduced to European awareness included sugar, which we have discussed in the food history context, but which also had specific pharmaceutical applications. Specific spices that were known in Europe but primarily through the long-distance trade were encountered directly by Crusaders who spent years in the producing regions. And hashish, the specific cannabis preparation whose name entered European vocabulary through the Crusader encounter with the Islamic world, became known to European audiences in ways that the pre-Crusade contact had not established. The specific assassin legend that we mentioned in the cannabis chapter deserves more detailed treatment here, because its specific mechanism of cultural transmission was the Crusader contact. The stories about the assassins, the Nizari Ismaili fighters whose specific political assassination tactics the Crusaders encountered and whose methods they found both terrifying and fascinating, were stories transmitted back to Europe by the specific soldiers and observers who encountered them, and the specific lurid embellishment of these stories as they travelled is a textbook case of how specific cultural narratives about drugs are constructed and transmitted. The actual Nizari Ismailis were not a hashish-crazed cult, and the specific etymology that connects assassin to hashish via hashashin is probably incorrect. But the specific stories that the Crusader contact generated of a master who motivated his followers through the specific promise of a drugged paradise experience, of warriors who felt no pain because of the specific substances they consumed, entered European cultural awareness and contributed to the specific European understanding of cannabis as a powerful, exotic, Eastern substance. The pilgrimage routes were the other major vector for the specific transfer of pharmaceutical knowledge and material across the medieval world. The specific routes, to Canterbury, to Santiago de Compostela, to Rome, to Jerusalem, brought together pilgrims from across the known world in specific locations whose specific commercial infrastructure included the exchange of goods and knowledge. The herbalist from the south of France who encountered the pilgrim from the Rhineland at a specific pilgrimage stop was the specific human connection through which the knowledge of specific plant preparations could be transmitted across geographic and cultural boundaries. The specific medical knowledge of the pilgrimage routes was also institutionalized in the specific hospitals and hospices that the religious institutions maintained along the major pilgrimage roads. These institutions, which provided medical care to the sick and injured pilgrims who made up a significant proportion of the pilgrimage traffic, were meeting points for the specific medical traditions of different regions and different practitioners, and the specific institutional knowledge they accumulated and transmitted was one of the ways in which the medical pharmacopoeia gradually expanded and standardized across the medieval period. Chapter 14. The Beer Witchery. How brewing culture and psychoactive plants intersected the brewing tradition of medieval Europe was not simply a fermentation tradition, it was a botanical tradition, the specific selection of plant materials for addition to fermented grain drinks to provide flavour, preservation, and specific additional effects beyond simple alcohol. The Groot tradition, the specific herbed ale brewing that preceded the hop's dominance, was the territory in which the botanical knowledge of the medieval period most directly intersected with the production of the everyday drink. And the specific plants that medieval brewers used for their Groot preparations included some of the most pharmacologically interesting species in the European environment. Bog myrtle, Myrica gale, was the most common Groot ingredient in northern European brewing, the specific shrub of the boggy heathlands whose aromatic properties made it effective as a flavouring and preservative. Its specific psychoactive properties are mild but real. It contains compounds that potentiate the effects of alcohol, making the specific intoxication of a bog myrtle ale somewhat different in character from the intoxication of simple alcohol. The specific traditional ales of Scotland and Scandinavia used bog myrtle extensively, and the specific testimony of people who have drunk traditional bog myrtle ale consistently describes a distinct quality to the intoxication. Yarrow, Achillea millefolium, was another significant Groot ingredient whose specific psychoactive contribution to the brewing tradition has been the subject of ethnobotanical interest. The specific compounds in yarrow, including the alkaloid acylletin and various thuyon-related compounds, are mildly psychoactive and would contribute, at the concentrations achievable in a brewed preparation, to the specific character of the intoxication. Wild rosemary, Ledum palustre, which is not the specific rosemary of the modern kitchen but the specific bogland plant of the heather communities, contains ledol and other terpenoid compounds with specific narcotic properties. The specific intoxication of wild rosemary ale has been described in the historical literature as more stupefying and more disorienting than simple alcohol would produce, consistent with the specific pharmacological contribution of the plant's compounds. The specific hops transition of the late medieval period, the gradual replacement of Groot with hops as the primary bittering and preserving addition to ale, was not merely a brewing technology change, it was a specific shift in the pharmacological character of the everyday drink. Hops, Humulus lupulus, contain lupulin, a compound with specific sedative properties that the modern pharmacology of hops has investigated in the context of sleep medicine, but they lack the specific potentiating and additional psychoactive contributions of the Groot herbs. The specific commercial and political dimensions of the hops transition have been analysed by historians who note that the specific territories that controlled Groot production, the Church, in many regions of Northern Europe, had specific monopoly rights over Groot production, were the territories that resisted hops adoption most strongly, while the secular commercial interests that benefited from the hops trade promoted its adoption. The specific pharmacological argument that Groot ales were more potently intoxicating and therefore more socially problematic than hopped beers was advanced by some contemporary advocates of the hop transition, though whether this was the real motivation or a specific post hoc justification for the economically motivated change is debated. The specific witch accusations that targeted specific brewers and alewives in the late medieval period sometimes included accusations of bewitching the ale, adding specific substances to alter its effects in specific ways. Whether this reflected specific actual practice, the specific deliberate addition of psychoactive substances to ale by specific brewers, or the specific projection of the fear of the doctored drink onto the figure of the female brewer, whose control of the communal intoxicant made her a specific focus of anxiety, is difficult to determine from the trial records. Both possibilities may have been true in specific cases. Chapter 15. The Accidental Mystics. When medieval religion and pharmacology collided, the mystical tradition of medieval Christianity produced some of the most remarkable documents in European intellectual and spiritual history. The specific visionary accounts of Hildegard of Bingen, the specific ecstatic writings of Meister Eckhart, the specific tortured illuminations of Julian of Norwich, the particular soaring theology of Meister Eckhart. These were genuine spiritual and intellectual achievements, and the attempt to reduce them entirely to pharmacology would be as wrong as the attempt to deny that the landscape in which they occurred included powerful psychoactive substances. But the intersection is genuinely interesting and genuinely important, and the specific honest history of medieval consciousness requires addressing it. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century Benedictine abbess whose writings on theology, natural philosophy and medicine make her one of the most remarkable figures of the medieval period, described specific visions throughout her life, with the specific detail of the person recording genuine perceptual experiences rather than literary constructions. The specific character of her visionary reports, the living light, the specific geometric patterns, the specific sense of the world becoming permeable to divine presence, has attracted the specific attention of neurologists who note the resemblance to the specific visual phenomena of migraine aura. Hildegard herself wrote about experiencing the shadow of the living light from childhood, and the specific temporal pattern of her visions, preceded by specific somatic symptoms, accompanied by specific visual phenomena, followed by specific exhaustion, is consistent with the migraine hypothesis that Charles Singer advanced in 1917 and that subsequent neurological analysis has supported. The migraine hypothesis does not reduce Hildegard's visions to pathology. The specific content of the experiences was shaped by her extraordinary intellect and her specific theological formation. But the specific neurological mechanism may have provided the specific perceptual access to the altered state that her theological tradition understood as divine communication. The specific fasting practices of medieval mystics are another point of intersection between the pharmacological and the spiritual. The extended fasting that the specific ascetic tradition endorsed as a preparation for divine vision is now understood to produce specific neurological effects, alterations in glucose metabolism, specific changes in neurotransmitter balance, specific ketotic states, that modify the character of perception in ways that could facilitate the specific visionary experiences that the fasting tradition aimed to produce. The specific Eucharistic theology of the medieval church, the doctrine of transubstantiation, by which the bread and wine of the Mass were understood to become the actual body and blood of Christ, created a specific sacramental context in which the conscious alteration produced by the wine of the Eucharist was understood in specific theological terms as the medium of divine encounter. The specific amount of wine consumed in the Eucharist was not typically intoxicating, but the specific psychological and theological context of its consumption, the specific expectation of divine encounter, the specific ritual preparation, the specific sensory environment of the medieval liturgy, created conditions in which even a small physiological effect could be amplified by the psychological anticipation into a specific experience of altered presence. The specific women mystics of the medieval period, the specific tradition of the Beguines and the female contemplatives, whose visionary accounts constitute one of the most distinctive bodies of literature in the medieval record, experienced and described altered states of consciousness with a specificity and a detail that the specific theological tradition understood as divine grace, and that the specific pharmacological framework of this video cannot fully explain but cannot entirely ignore. The specific herbal preparations of the monastic tradition were available to the women who ran those monasteries. The specific plants of the monastery garden, the henbane, the opium poppies, the various nightshade preparations, were the plants that the abbess managed, and whose properties she understood at least as well as any practitioner in the medieval world. Whether the specific mystical experiences of specific medieval religious women involved the specific, deliberate or accidental contribution of these preparations to the specific states they described is a question the historical record does not definitively answer. What can be said is that the specific, altered states of consciousness produced by the medieval mystics occurred in a specific landscape saturated with psychoactive substances, natural, cultivated, accidentally consumed, and in some cases deliberately deployed. The specific separation of the pharmacological from the spiritual, of the bodily experience from the divine encounter, that the specific theological tradition maintained was not a separation that the specific medieval landscape of consciousness easily enforced. Chapter 16. The Witch Trials. How the destruction of knowledge changed European pharmacology forever. At some point in the late 14th century, something began to change. The specific folk practice tradition that had maintained the knowledge of the medieval plant pharmacopoeia, the wise women, the cunning men, the herbalists and midwives and apothecaries of the rural and urban community, began to encounter a specific, intensified institutional hostility from the church, and subsequently from the secular legal systems that the church influenced. The specific events that marked this change are well known in their general outlines. The publication of the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487, the specific escalation of witch trial prosecutions through the 15th and 16th centuries, the specific burning of hundreds of thousands of people across Europe over roughly 3 centuries for crimes that were defined primarily in terms of the specific supernatural capabilities attributed to them. But the specific pharmacological dimension of the witch trials, the specific way in which the knowledge tradition we have been discussing was identified, targeted and destroyed, is less well understood in the popular history than the general outline of the persecution. The specific, Charges that appeared most consistently in witch trial prosecutions were charges that directly targeted the specific pharmacological knowledge of the folk tradition, the making and using of flying ointments, the specific knowledge of plant preparations that caused illness or death, the specific ability to manipulate the specific physiological states of other people, the fertility ointments, the love potions, the specific preparations that altered the consciousness or the health of their targets. These were, stripped of their supernatural framing, charges of possessing and using the specific psychoactive and pharmacologically active knowledge that the folk tradition had maintained. The Malleus Maleficarum, the specific Dominican Inquisitor's handbook for witch trial prosecution, described the flying ointment in specific detail that makes clear its authors understood the specific pharmacological mechanism, even while attributing its effects to diabolical assistance. The specific description of the preparation's ingredients, the nightshade plants, the specific processes of rendering and combination, is detailed enough to be a recipe rather than an allegation, and the specific awareness that the preparation produced the specific experiences attributed to it through specific physical means is evident in the text, even as the theological interpretation attributes the mechanism to demonic power. The specific destruction this persecution produced in the knowledge tradition was not total. The knowledge survived in modified forms in the specific literary tradition of the herbals and pharmacopoeias that the printing press was beginning to produce in the same period, in the specific medical tradition that continued to use many of the same preparations under the cover of medical authorization. But the specific oral tradition of the folk practitioner, the specific knowledge that the wise woman carried in her specific personal understanding of the specific plants of her specific landscape, was systematically targeted and substantially destroyed. The specific public health cost of this destruction is genuinely difficult to calculate, but it was substantial. The communities that lost their wise women lost their specific pain management expertise, their specific obstetric knowledge, their specific understanding of which plant preparations managed, which conditions in the specific doses and specific preparations that experience had developed. The physician tradition that survived was the physician tradition of the learned man, the university-trained professional who accessed the classical authorities through the specific Latin texts. And this tradition, for all its genuine learning, had specific gaps where the folk knowledge tradition's practical experience was irreplaceable. The specific irony of the witch trial era, that the most intense persecution of folk pharmaceutical knowledge occurred at exactly the same period as the printing press was making the classical pharmacological texts more widely available than they had ever been, is one of the specific defining ironies of the late medieval and early modern intellectual history. The specific knowledge that was being burned alongside its practitioners was being simultaneously preserved in the specific printed herbals of the period, though in a form that lost the specific practical empirical character that made the oral tradition genuinely useful. Chapter 17. The Arab Transmission. How Islamic scholarship preserved and extended medieval pharmacology. The specific transmission of the classical pharmacological knowledge that medieval European medicine built on was not primarily a European project. It was primarily an Arab and Islamic project, and the specific intellectual debt that medieval European pharmacology owed to the scholars of the Islamic world was one of the most significant and least acknowledged features of the period's intellectual history. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the specific institutional infrastructure for the preservation and transmission of classical learning, the libraries, the schools, the specific networks of literate professionals, largely collapsed with it. The specific Greek pharmacological texts of Dioscorides, Galen, and the other classical authors survived in the Byzantine East and were translated into Arabic in the Great Translation movement of the 8th and 9th centuries. The specific Islamic scholars who translated these texts did not merely preserve them, they extended, corrected, and substantially improved on them, adding the specific botanical knowledge of the Islamic world's far more extensive geographic reach and the specific pharmaceutical knowledge of their own extensive empirical tradition. Avicenna ibn Sina, whose canon of medicine we have mentioned throughout this script, was the specific most important figure in this tradition for the specific topic we are discussing. His pharmacological knowledge was genuinely encyclopedic, and his specific treatments of the substances we have discussed, opium, henbane, cannabis, mandrake, combined the classical tradition with substantial original clinical observation in ways that produced a more accurate and more practically useful account of their properties than the purely classical tradition had achieved. The specific sections of the canon dealing with narcotic substances are extraordinary documents. Avicenna's specific descriptions of the signs of opium overdose, the specific clinical observations of a physician who had seen overdoses and who described them with the specific accuracy of the trained observer, are clinically accurate by modern standards. His specific warnings about the specific patterns of habituation and escalating dose requirement that regular opium use produced describe what modern pharmacology understands as tolerance with specific clarity. His specific recommendations for the management of opium withdrawal, the gradual dose reduction rather than abrupt cessation, are consistent with the best modern clinical practice for opioid detoxification. The specific knowledge of cannabis in the Islamic medical tradition was considerably more developed than in the European tradition, for the specific reason that cannabis preparations were more extensively used in the Islamic world for medical, recreational and specific religious purposes in specific communities than they were in medieval Europe. The specific Islamic medical literature on cannabis described a range of preparations, a range of doses, and a range of specific effects with the specific clinical detail of the tradition that had extensive experience of the substance. The transmission of this knowledge to European medicine happened through specific channels. The translation movement of the 12th century, in which scholars in the specific contact zones of southern Spain and Sicily translated the Arabic medical texts into Latin. The specific Crusader contacts that brought European practitioners into direct contact with Islamic medical practice, and the specific commercial relationships of the Mediterranean trade that created ongoing exchange between the medical traditions of the Islamic and Christian worlds. The specific Salerno Medical School, the first significant European medical school operating in southern Italy from roughly the 10th century, was the specific institutional site of the earliest systematic engagement between European and Islamic medical knowledge, and the specific pharmacological texts produced at Salerno reflect the specific synthesis of the classical tradition with the Islamic extensions and additions that the Salernitan scholars had access to through their specific geographic position in the contact zone between the two traditions. Chapter 18. The specific experience. What a medieval high actually felt like. Let's stop being historical for a moment and try to be phenomenological, because the entire enterprise of this video, the specific comprehensive account of medieval consciousness-altering substances, is ultimately in service of the specific question that the title asks. What did getting high actually feel like in the Middle Ages? What was the specific subjective experience of the medieval person who consumed the specific substances we have been discussing? The honest answer is that we cannot know this with certainty, because the specific subjective experience of consciousness is the one thing that the documentary record cannot preserve. The feeling of the henbane's warmth spreading through the limbs, the specific visual shimmer of the ergot alkaloids reorganizing perception, the specific heavy relaxation of the opium preparation taking hold in the specific exhausted body of the medieval agricultural labourer. These experiences were had. They were real. They changed the specific moment-to-moment consciousness of the people who experienced them in ways that were, for that specific person, as vivid and as present as anything they ever experienced. And they are, in their specific subjective character, entirely inaccessible to historical reconstruction. What we can do is triangulate the specific pharmacological knowledge of what these substances do, established through the specific centuries of accumulation since the medieval period, including the specific clinical research of the 20th century, the specific first-person accounts of people who have had these experiences, the specific brain imaging research that shows what these compounds do to neural activity, gives us a partial picture. The specific written accounts that medieval people did produce, the mystic's vision description, the physician's clinical note, the witch trial testimony, give us another partial picture. The specific reconstruction experiments of researchers who have tried the historical preparations give us a third. The henbane experience, the specific anticholinergic trip of the nightshade family at a dose insufficient to produce full delirium, was probably characterized by the specific warm sedation that scopolamine produces, the specific loosening of cognitive boundaries, the specific visual quality of the world becoming slightly luminous and slightly strange. At higher doses, the specific delirium of the anticholinergic state, the confusion of dream and waking, the specific hallucinatory encounters with figures and scenes of intense vividness, would have been the dominant experience. The ergot experience, the specific LSD-adjacent trip of the lysergic acid compounds, was probably characterized by the specific visual phenomena that ergot alkaloids produce, the intensification of color, the specific geometric patterns that the visual cortex generates when serotonin receptors are stimulated in the specific way that tryptamine psychedelics produce, the specific emotional dimension of the ergot experience, the anxiety, the specific intense ambivalence between terror and euphoria that the psychedelic state produces was probably also present, colored by the specific cultural expectations of the person experiencing it, and by the specific collective character of the mass poisoning events in which most medieval ergot experiences occurred. The opium experience, the specific warm sedation of the mu-opioid receptor agonism, was probably experienced in medieval settings in ways that are genuinely familiar to the modern reader who has received opioid analgesia for medical purposes. The specific, comprehensive relief from pain, the specific warm heaviness, the specific narrowing of consciousness from the broad anxiety of the normally conscious mind to the specific small warm present of the opioid state. The specific cultural interpretation of all these experiences was the specific cultural interpretation of the medieval world, a world in which the boundary between natural and supernatural was not the sharp epistemological division of the modern scientific worldview, but a specific permeable membrane through which divine and diabolical presences routinely passed, in which the specific altered state of consciousness was as likely to be understood as divine communication or demonic possession as to be understood in any naturalistic terms. The medieval person who had a profound, consciousness-altering experience from any of the substances we have discussed could not have been, given the specific intellectual framework of their world, a person who understood their experience as a pharmacological event. They understood it as a spiritual one. The specific content of the experience, the visions, the encounters, the specific feelings of presence and significance, was spiritual content, interpreted through the specific theological vocabulary of the medieval Christian tradition, or the specific magical vocabulary of the folk tradition, depending on the specific person and the specific context. This does not make the experience less real. The specific philosophical question of whether the divine presence experienced in a psilocybin session or a henbane-induced vision is really divine, or merely pharmacological, is a question that the specific epistemological framework of modern secular science answers one way, and that the specific theological framework of the medieval world answered another. The experience itself, the specific intensity of the consciousness alteration, the specific meaning it carried for the person having it, was real regardless of the interpretive framework applied to it. Chapter 19. The Children and the Accidental. How the young and the unsuspecting encountered medieval psychoactives. The medieval pharmacological landscape was not selective about its recipients. The specific substances we have discussed did not limit their effects to the specific adult practitioners who used them deliberately, or the specific individuals who encountered them knowingly. The medieval child lived in the same landscape as the medieval adult, ate the same contaminated bread, breathed the same smoke from the same fires in which the same herbs burned, and was given the same medicinal preparations by the same practitioners who managed their illnesses. The children who received henbane preparations for toothache, a specific documented medical use of the plant in the medieval period, were children receiving a medication with specific psychoactive properties at doses calibrated for adults by practitioners whose understanding of pediatric pharmacokinetics was empirical at best. The specific weight-based differences in drug response between children and adults. The specific reason that modern pediatric pharmacology requires specific weight-adjusted dosing were not systematically accounted for in the medieval pharmaceutical tradition. The child who received the adult's dose of the henbane toothache preparation received a relatively larger dose and had a relatively more intense experience. The specific records of children's medical treatment in the medieval period include descriptions of the effects of these preparations that are recognizable as the specific pharmacological effects we have been discussing. the sedation, the apparent insensibility, the specific difficulty in waking that the anticholinergic preparations produced, the specific medieval interpretation of these effects as the beneficial action of the preparation in producing the sleep that the sick child required, was not entirely wrong. The preparation was producing the sedation it was intended to produce. It was also occasionally producing considerably more than was intended. The harvest season, the specific period when the extended family and the community's labour was concentrated in the fields over long days, was the specific period when the most vulnerable members of the community were most likely to have unsupervised access to specific hazardous plants. The children left at the field's edge while the adults worked, the specific foraging behaviour of children whose caloric needs drove them toward the available food sources, the specific attractive appearance of certain poisonous and psychoactive berries, the belladonna's shining blackberries, the specific inviting appearance of the henbane seed pods, created the specific conditions for the accidental paediatric poisoning that the medical literature of the period records with specific regularity. The specific emergency management of the child who had eaten the wrong berries was the emergency management of the wise woman who recognized the symptoms, the dilated pupils, the flushing, the specific agitated behavior of the anticholinergic toxidrome, and who applied the specific available interventions that the empirical tradition had developed for the management of the poisoned patient. Whether these interventions were effective depended on the specific severity of the poisoning and the specific skill of the practitioner, and the outcomes ranged from complete recovery to the specific fatality that the most severe cases produced. The accidental consumption of ergot-contaminated grain by children produced the specific pediatric version of the ergotism that we discussed in the adult context. The specific convulsions, the specific visual experiences, the specific frightening behavioral changes that the alkaloids produced in small bodies that had consumed the contaminated grain in the specific relative quantities that children consumed relative to their body weight. The specific epidemic records of ergotism frequently note the specific more severe course of the disease in children, consistent with the specific pharmacokinetic reality that body weight adjusted doses were higher in the pediatric population. Chapter 20. The Legacy. How medieval pharmacology shaped the modern world. The medieval relationship with consciousness-altering substances was not merely historical, it was foundational, the specific empirical tradition from which the modern pharmacology of the compounds we have been discussing grew, and the specific cultural framework within which the long human relationship with these substances was processed and transmitted. The opium poppy that Bayer's chemists worked with in 1897, synthesizing the specific diacetyl morphine that they named heroin, was the same poppy that the medieval monastery garden grew, processed through the specific millennia of pharmacological accumulation that the period between the medieval monks and the 19th century chemists represented. The specific alkaloid chemistry that the Bayer chemists understood and manipulated was the chemistry that the medieval physician knew empirically, without the specific vocabulary to describe it. The specific plant families, the nightshades, the poppies, the hemp family, that have generated the most significant pharmacological developments of the modern era were the specific plant families that the medieval tradition knew best and used most extensively. The specific medical applications that the modern pharmaceutical industry pursues, the anticholinergic drugs, the opioid analgesics, the cannabis-derived medicines, are the specific applications that the medieval tradition had identified empirically and that the subsequent centuries refined and formalized. The specific ethnobotanical research tradition, the academic discipline that investigates the plant knowledge of traditional cultures, owes a specific intellectual debt to the medieval botanical tradition that it frequently acknowledges by consulting the specific medieval herbal literature as one of its primary sources. The specific herbals of Hildegard of Bingen, of Dioscorides as transmitted through medieval copies, of the various anonymous compilations that the medieval period produced. These are primary sources for the specific ethnopharmacological investigation of which plants were used for which purposes in the specific cultural context of medieval Europe. The specific war on drugs that has dominated global drug policy for the past century, the specific effort to eliminate the production and distribution of the substances that the medieval tradition used as medicine, as ritual tool, and as everyday relief from the specific physical suffering of the human condition, is in one specific sense an attempt to undo what the medieval world took for granted, the specific availability of consciousness-altering substances as a normal feature of the human pharmacological landscape. The specific failure of this attempt, the specific consistent inability of the most aggressive and most expensive enforcement effort in human history to eliminate the human desire for and use of consciousness-altering substances, is consistent with what the medieval tradition understood without needing to articulate it, that the human relationship with these substances is ancient, persistent, and rooted in specific biological and psychological needs that do not disappear because their satisfaction has been declared illegal. Chapter 21. The Plants Today, where medieval pharmacology meets modern science. The plants we have been discussing are still here. The opium poppy still grows in monastery gardens, in ornamental beds, in the wild margins of European fields. The henbane still grows in disturbed ground across northern Europe, its specific glandular hairy leaves and its specific dirty yellow flowers unchanged from the plants that the medieval herbalist harvested. The mandrake still grows in the Mediterranean countries where the medieval tradition knew it. The liberty cap still fruits in the autumn grasslands of northern Europe, in exactly the conditions that the medieval shepherd would have encountered it. The specific scientific investigation of these plants that the 20th and 21st centuries have pursued has produced specific, concrete medical advances that confirm what the medieval empirical tradition knew without the specific vocabulary to express it. The specific pain-relieving properties of the opiates are the foundation of modern analgesia. The morphine and its derivatives remain, a century after heroin, the most effective pain medications available for severe pain. The specific anticholinergic properties of the nightshade alkaloids are used in modern medicine. Atropine in cardiac care and ophthalmology, scopolamine for motion sickness and nausea management. The specific cannabinoids of the cannabis plant are the subject of the most active pharmaceutical research program currently in progress. The specific revival of psychedelic research in the 21st century, the specific clinical investigation of psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine and LSD for specific psychiatric conditions including depression, PTSD and addiction, is the specific scientific return to a territory that the medieval tradition inhabited without the specific methodological tools to map it. The specific therapeutic use of consciousness alteration that the medieval tradition practiced empirically is being reinvestigated with the specific rigor of modern clinical trial methodology, and the specific results are, in several cases, genuinely remarkable. The psilocybin research of Robin Carhart Harris and colleagues at Imperial College London, and of Roland Griffiths and colleagues at Johns Hopkins University, has demonstrated specific clinical efficacy for psilocybin-assisted therapy in treatment-resistant depression, with effect sizes that compare favourably to existing antidepressant treatments. The specific MDMA-assisted therapy research for PTSD has produced the specific clinical results that led to FDA breakthrough therapy designation. The specific ketamine and esketamine research has produced the specific first genuinely new class of antidepressant in decades. These are not the same experiences that the medieval tradition produced. The specific clinical context of the modern psychedelic therapy session, the specific preparation, the specific therapeutic relationship, the specific integration of the experience into a broader therapeutic process, is different from the specific medieval context in every way except the specific pharmacological mechanism, but the specific insight that certain states of consciousness have specific therapeutic value, that certain substances can produce specific beneficial changes in the way the mind processes experience, is an insight that the medieval tradition inhabited empirically and that the modern tradition is now confirming scientifically. Chapter 22. The Continuing Story. Medieval Lessons for Modern Drug Culture. The medieval approach to consciousness, altering substances contained specific wisdom that the specific arrogance of the modern scientific tradition has sometimes been slow to acknowledge. The specific integration of the plant pharmacopoeia into the everyday medical practice. The specific understanding that the substances that alter consciousness are also the substances that relieve pain, induce sleep, and manage the specific symptoms of the specific conditions that medicine is there to treat, was an integration that the modern period temporarily dissolved in the specific, regulatory separation of the medical from the recreational, the therapeutic from the euphoric, the specific treatment from the specific pleasure. The specific wisdom of the dose, the medieval tradition's hard-won understanding that the difference between medicine and poison was primarily the quantity consumed, and that the knowledge of appropriate quantities was the specific, practical knowledge that made the difference, is a wisdom that the modern regulatory tradition has attempted to systematize through the specific mechanisms of clinical trials, dosing guidelines, and prescribing regulations. The specific failure of these mechanisms in the specific case of the opioid epidemic, the specific inability of the regulatory system to prevent the specific catastrophic overprescribing that produced mass addiction, suggests that the specific institutional knowledge of the dose is harder to maintain in the specific commercial context of the modern pharmaceutical market than the medieval empirical tradition managed in the specific context of the wise woman's practice. The specific integration of the consciousness-altering experience into the specific cultural and community life of the medieval period, the specific way in which the altered state was embedded in the feast, the ritual, the healing ceremony, the specific meaningful occasion rather than isolated in the specific individual act of recreational consumption, reflected a specific understanding of the importance of set and setting that the modern scientific tradition has rediscovered, and that the modern harm reduction movement is attempting to apply in the specific contemporary context. The specific medieval understanding that some states of consciousness had specific spiritual and therapeutic value, that the specific altered perception of the mystic and the specific pain-free state of the opium patient, and the specific loosened consciousness of the ale drinker at the end of the harvest were specific, human goods worth pursuing and worth protecting, was an understanding that the specific moral framework of the modern drug war has tried to override with the specific moral framework of the dangerous intoxicant that must be suppressed, regardless of the specific human value it provides. The specific failure of this suppression, which the specific history of the modern drug war has comprehensively documented, suggests that the specific medieval approach, for all its specific limitations, understood something important about the human relationship with consciousness, altering substances that the modern approach consistently misses, that the desire to alter consciousness is not a pathology. It is one of the most persistent and universal features of human experience. The specific question is not whether people will alter their consciousness. They will. The specific question is what conditions, what specific cultural frameworks, what specific knowledge traditions, what specific social integrations make the alteration more or less likely to serve human flourishing. Here are chapters 23, 24, and 25, continuing in exactly the same voice, immersive register, and structural depth as the original script. Chapter 23, The Traveller's Pharmacopoeia. What merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers carried and consumed on the road. The medieval road was its own pharmacological environment, not the road of the modern traveller, not the specific comfortable progression from one heated interior to another, the specific reliable infrastructure of the motorway service station and the hotel chain, and the specific assumption that the physical conditions of travel will be managed by the specific technologies of the modern transportation system. The medieval road was the specific exposed environment of the person who was moving through a landscape on foot or horseback, sleeping in conditions that range from the adequate inn to the ditch, eating what was available rather than what was chosen, and managing the specific physical challenges of sustained travel with whatever the specific portable pharmacopoeia of the traveller contained. The specific ailments of the medieval traveller were the ailments that sustained physical exertion, inadequate shelter, irregular food, and the specific exposure to whatever the road's population was carrying produced with reliable predictability, the blisters and the joint pain of the long march, the specific gastrointestinal complaints of the person who had eaten the water, or the food of an unfamiliar region, and whose intestinal flora had not yet made its peace with the local microbial environment. The specific fevers of the traveller who had passed through a malarial region, or encountered the typhoid of the contaminated water source. The specific injuries of the road, the twisted ankle, the horse-related injury, the specific violence of the bandit encounter that the medieval road produced often enough to be a genuine occupational hazard of travel. The traveller's medicine kit was accordingly the portable version of the household medicine chest, the specific small selection of preparations that the experienced traveller had learned to carry based on the specific ailments most likely to be encountered on the specific route. The dried opium preparation for serious pain, compact, potent, and the specific, most effective analgesic available. The specific herbal preparations for fever management. The wound dressings prepared with the specific antimicrobial herbs that the tradition identified as appropriate. The specific laxatives and astringents for the gastrointestinal complaints that travel reliably produced. The merchant who travelled the specific long-distance routes of medieval commerce was the traveller with the most developed portable pharmacology, not merely because their specific exposure to the range of conditions that the long-distance trade route produced was greater than that of the local traveller, but because the specific, commercial access to pharmaceutical materials that their trade gave them made the stocking and maintenance of an adequate travelling pharmacy more practical than it was for the specific pilgrim or the specific soldier. The specific merchant travelling the specific route from Bruges to Venice and back was the specific traveller who might supplement their portable pharmacy with the specific preparations available in the specific markets of each city they passed through. The pilgrim's pharmacology was the pharmacology of the specifically motivated traveller, the person whose specific spiritual purpose of the journey created a specific relationship with physical suffering that complicated the straightforward management of pain and illness that the merchant's purely practical framework permitted. The specific Christian theology of the pilgrimage as an act of penance, the specific understanding that the physical suffering of the journey was part of its spiritual value, that the aching feet and the cold nights were the specific bodily currency of the spiritual accounting that the pilgrimage was intended to settle, created a specific ambivalence about pain relief that the merely commercial traveller did not share. The pilgrim who took opium for their blistered feet was the pilgrim who was short-circuiting the specific, penitential dimension of the suffering they had undertaken to perform. Whether this was spiritually acceptable was a specific theological question that the pilgrim negotiated in the specific context of their own conscience and the specific guidance of whatever spiritual director they had access to. The practical reality of medieval pilgrimage, the specific large numbers of people travelling long distances with inadequate footwear and insufficient nutrition, suggests that the specific philosophical concern about pain management was, in many specific cases, overridden by the specific urgency of the pain. The soldier's pharmacology was the pharmacology of the specific extreme, the person who encountered the most severe injuries, the most sustained physical depletion, and the most acute need for the specific pain management that the medieval pharmacopeia's most potent preparations could provide. The specific military medical tradition of the medieval period, the field surgeons, the hospital brothers, the specific camp followers who provided the basic medical care of the medieval army, carried the specific preparations that their experience of battlefield medicine had identified as most necessary. The soporific sponge, the specific anesthetic preparation of henbane, opium, mandrake, and other sedative compounds soaked into a sponge and held beneath the patient's nose, appears in the specific military surgical context as the preparation most associated with the specific surgical interventions that the battlefield required. The amputation of the gangrenous limb, the extraction of the arrow from the deep wound, the specific surgical procedures that the medieval army's medical service was called upon to perform in conditions of specific urgency that made the specific effectiveness of the anesthetic preparation a genuine matter of life and death rather than merely of comfort. The specific reliability of the soporific sponge, the specific consistency of its anesthetic effect across the specific range of doses achievable with medieval preparation techniques, was probably the most significant limitation of medieval surgical anesthesia. The specific narrow therapeutic window of the nightshade alkaloids meant that the preparation that produced adequate sedation for surgery and the preparation that produced fatal overdose were not reliably distinguishable in the specific conditions of medieval field medicine. The specific clinical judgment of the experienced military surgeon, the accumulated understanding of how much was enough and how much was too much, was the specific irreplaceable knowledge that made the difference, and the specific loss of that clinical judgment through the death or capture of experienced medical personnel was a genuine, operational medical risk. The road's own specific pharmacology, the specific herbs that grew along the specific routes and whose specific properties the experienced traveller recognised, was the supplement to the portable pharmacy that the traveller who could identify the specific plants of the specific landscape they were traversing could draw on. The plantain growing along the road's edge, whose specific anti-inflammatory properties made it useful for wound dressing. The specific willow bark of the stream banks, whose specific salicylate content provided the aspirin-like pain relief that the medieval traveller knew empirically without the specific chemical vocabulary. The specific roadside plants of the European landscape were the specific freely available pharmacy of the traveller who knew how to read the landscape. The inn was the specific built environment of the traveller's pharmacology, the place where the specific preparations of the innkeeper's domestic pharmacy were available alongside the specific ale and the specific food of the establishment. The innkeeper, who also functioned as a rudimentary apothecary, selling specific preparations from the household stock to travellers who had exhausted or lost their own travelling pharmacy, was a specific documented feature of the medieval hospitality industry, and the specific boundary between the innkeeper's hospitality and the innkeeper's medical provision was, in the specific conditions of the medieval road, often as permeable as the boundary between the alehouse and the apothecary. Conclusion: the peasant in the field. Why none of this is as strange as it seems, come back to the field. It is still approximately 12:30. The sun is still lowering toward the horizon. Your back still aches in the specific, comprehensive way that 6 hours of bending produces in the human lumbar spine. The neighbour who sat down beside you is still there, and the specific pouch at their belt still contains whatever it contains. You know more now about what that pouch might hold than you did at the beginning of this video. You know that the medieval pharmacological landscape was saturated with substances that altered consciousness, that the fields themselves might be contaminated with ergot, that the herbs in the monastery garden included some of the most potent psychoactive plants in Europe, that the ale in the evening tavern might be brewed with specific additions that modified its effects beyond simple alcohol, that the physician's preparations and the wise woman's preparations included compounds whose specific properties the modern pharmaceutical industry has spent a century investigating. You also know something more important than the catalogue of substances. You know that the medieval person's relationship with consciousness alteration was not the specific shameful secret of the modern war on drugs imagination, not the specific transgression of the boundary between the permitted and the forbidden that the modern regulatory framework has made central to the experience of drug use. It was the specific ordinary feature of the specific human experience of a world in which pain was constant, the body's demands were urgent, the specific relief of the substance was accessible, and the specific cultural frameworks for understanding the altered state, the medical, the religious, the magical, the social, were as varied and as sophisticated as the substances themselves. The peasant who reached for the flask was not a deviant. They were a human being managing a specific human situation with the specific tools available to them. The monk who compounded the henbane preparation was not a criminal. He was a medical practitioner applying the best available knowledge to the specific relief of specific suffering. The wise woman who knew the flying ointment was not a witch. She was a pharmacologist without the specific vocabulary, whose specific knowledge was the most practically sophisticated pharmaceutical tradition available in her specific community. The specific destruction of that tradition, the specific burning of the knowledge alongside the people who held it, was one of the specific tragedies of the late medieval period, and its specific echoes in the specific war on drugs of the modern era are not coincidental. The specific impulse that burned the wise women and the specific impulse that incarcerates the drug user are not the same impulse, but they share the specific family resemblance of the institutional response that misidentifies the specific human desire for consciousness alteration as a specific moral failing requiring specific coercive correction. The medieval period, for all its specific limitations, the specific ignorance of germ theory, the specific inadequacy of the medical tools, the specific institutional violence of the Inquisition, understood something about human beings and their relationship with consciousness that the specific regulatory framework of the modern world still struggles with. That the desire to feel different from how you normally feel is not a pathology. It is not a moral failing. It is one of the specific, oldest, most persistent and most characteristically human features of the species that has been altering its consciousness since long before the medieval period. In every culture, in every continent, through every specific substance and every specific method that the specific landscape of human habitation has provided. The neighbour with the pouch at their belt reaches into it. What they produce is what specific medieval people had, in some combination, throughout the period we've examined. The specific relief from the specific pain, the specific loosening of the specific tension, the specific small pleasure of the specific moment made slightly better by the specific means available. You accept it. Of course you do. You are a human being, and this is what human beings do. The evening settles over the field. The specific stars begin to appear in the specific sky, above the specific medieval English countryside. Tomorrow the work begins again. Tonight, there is the specific warmth of the something in the flask, the specific company of the neighbour, the specific small pleasure of the body that has worked hard and is now, for a specific hour, at rest. The specific history of getting high in medieval times is, in the end, the specific history of the human body's needs and the specific human ingenuity in meeting them. It is the history of the plants and the fungi and the fermented grains and the specific knowledge of how to use them that the medieval tradition accumulated, transmitted, protected, and, in the specific catastrophe of the witch trials, partially lost. It is also a history that has not ended. The specific plants are still here, the specific desire is still here, the specific wisdom and the specific folly of the human relationship with these substances are still here, playing out in the specific contemporary forms of the crisis and the therapy and the policy debate and the specific individual person making the specific choice of the specific evening. The medieval peasant in the field and the specific modern person reading about them are separated by 8 centuries of specific history. They are connected by the specific persistent human desire that the specific substance in the specific pouch was there to address. That desire is not going away, it never did.